So it's really important to talk about refreshing versus feeding. You'll notice I use those words a little bit interchangeably, but the most important thing here is this is where people a lot of times get stuck, and a lot of people come to me and they'll say, oh, my starter died. And, a friend of mine sent me a picture and there's mold on top of her starter. And usually I rarely see mold on starter because it has the properties of the microbes help fight off any bad bacteria. And so we walked through what happened with her starter. And what was happening was she first got her portion starter. She fed it according to the directions. And then once it became active, she wasn't really ready to use it. So she fed it again, the same amount, and then fed it again, and then fed it again. And so what was happening was, just like we talked about in the previous section about how as it ferments, not only are the yeast and bacteria eating and processing and taking apart the flour, the food that we put into the container, but they are also multiplying. So the population of that small amount of sourdough starter we started with is growing and expanding exponentially, and it's creating waste because there's some die-off from some of the microbes, some are getting damaged. And so if we start with a small colony and we start feeding it, it becomes active and the colony has now expanded maybe 100 times the amount, and we still feed it that same small portion that you would have fed it at the beginning. So a little analogy I like to make for this is, if you picture like the first Thanksgiving, Thanksgiving we celebrate, many of us in America, we celebrate every year. So if you picture our first Thanksgiving, that small group of people eating all that food. It was a really abundant amount of food for that group of people. Well, many years later, the population in that area of the United States has expanded. There's huge cities there. So if we were to go to that same area and try to give them the same feast, you'd have a lot of hungry, agitated people. Or another analogy I love is, if you have teenagers, you'd appreciate this. Well, if you invite 5 teenagers over to enjoy 2 boxes of pizza, they might be satisfied. But if you serve that same 2 boxes of pizza to a group of 40 teenagers or 50 teenagers, you're going to have a lot of cranky kids on your hands. So it's the same kind of concept with the sourdough starter, is if we continue feeding and feeding and feeding, that population continues growing. And the food that we're giving to that ginormous population that's growing, not only is there waste products inside that starter, but now we have this population that we're feeding that has expanded to be too much for the small amount that we're feeding. So that's why you cannot just feed your starter over and over. You have to make sure you're doing a refreshing process, which means that you're either discarding by adding the leftover starter to a discard jar, or taking a small portion out into a new container, or you're using your active starter in a recipe and then feeding that small remainder that's left in your jar or your container.